To understand the monster, you must first understand the cesspool that created her. You must walk through the marble halls of a palace where sanity had bled out long ago, where whispers were sharper than any blade, and where survival was a prize awarded only to the lucky, the invisible, or the utterly ruthless. This was Rome in the final, suffocating days of the Emperor Caligula. A world lit by the fires of paranoia. A world where the emperor might appoint his horse to the Senate as a joke, and the senators would have to applaud. A world where an offhand comment at dinner could mean a death sentence before dessert. To live in the orbit of Caligula was to live on the knife's edge of a madman's whim. Every sunrise was a surprise. And in this theater of madness, there was a man who should have been dead a dozen times over. His name was Tiberius Claudius Drusus. He was Caligula's uncle, a stooped figure in his late 40s, afflicted with a limp, a stammer, and a slight deafness that made him seem perpetually confused. He was the royal family's laughingstock, their pet intellectual, their harmless fool. While his relatives were systematically executed around him, Claudius survived. He survived because he was underestimated. He survived because, in a world of ambitious predators, nobody considered a limping, stuttering scholar a threat. He was a gray rock in a raging river of blood, unremarkable and therefore untouched by the current. But his survival was not just luck, it was a strategy. By playing the fool, he had mastered the most important art in Caligula's Rome, the art of being forgotten. And it was to this man, this professional survivor nearly 50 years of age, that the imperial family made a transaction. They gave him a bride. Her name was Valeria Messalina. She was about 15 years old. She was not a commoner, not a rising socialite. She was a blue-blooded aristocrat of the highest order, a direct descendant of the two most powerful bloodlines in Roman history. Through her mother, she carried the legacy of Mark Antony. Through her grandmother, she was the great-grandniece of the divine Emperor Augustus himself. She was a living, breathing vessel of imperial legitimacy. Her marriage to Claudius wasn't a union of love or even affection. It was a transaction written in the cold ink of political necessity, a move to tie the seemingly harmless branch of the family to its powerful roots. For Claudius, it was a shield. For Messalina, it was a sentence. At an age when other girls were learning about womanhood, she was handed over to a man 3 times her senior, a man who drooled and twitched to become a wife in the most dangerous house in the world. She was a pawn in a game she hadn't chosen, a gilded cage her only future. Then, on the 24th of January, 41 A.D., the game board was flipped over. The Praetorian Guard, the elite bodyguards of the emperor, the very men sworn to protect him, decided they had had enough of Caligula's insanity. They cornered him in a secluded corridor of the palace and did what Rome did best. They murdered him. The palace erupted into chaos. Screams echoed through the halls. Senators, smelling a chance to restore the Republic, began plotting. The guards, having just killed one emperor, now realized they needed another to justify their own existence and secure their pay. It was a moment of pure, terrifying anarchy. And hiding behind a curtain, trembling in fear for his life, was Claudius. A Praetorian guard named Gratus, searching the abandoned imperial quarters, saw a pair of feet poking out from beneath a heavy drape. Thinking it was a looter, he pulled the curtain aside and found the emperor's uncle, who immediately fell to his knees and begged for his life. In that moment, history turned on a dime. Gratus and his fellow guards didn't see a fool. They saw an opportunity. They saw the last adult male of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. They saw a familiar, controllable face who could legitimize their bloody actions. They didn't offer him a choice. They hoisted the terrified Claudius onto their shoulders, marched him to the Praetorian camp, and declared him the new Emperor of Rome. For Messalina, this was the moment her world shattered and was reborn. One minute, she was the teenage wife of the court jester. The next, she was the empress of the most powerful empire on earth. The psychological whiplash is almost impossible to imagine. She was barely a woman, yet she now stood at the absolute pinnacle of power. But this was not a fairy tale. Power in Rome was not a crown, it was a target, and Messalina, for all her youth, seemed to understand this with a chilling, instinctual clarity. She knew her husband was seen as weak, a puppet emperor put on the throne by soldiers. She knew his position was precarious, and most importantly, she knew the only currency that truly mattered was the future, her children, her son, Britannicus, and her daughter, Octavia. They were her only real claim to lasting power, the only reason she wouldn't be discarded the moment Claudius died, and to protect them, she would have to stop being a child. She would have to become a player in the deadliest game in the world. Her first targets were the women who could challenge her. The imperial family was a viper's nest of competing bloodlines, and there were other women with claims just as strong as hers. One was Julia Livilla, Caligula's own sister, another great-granddaughter of Augustus. She was beautiful, popular, and dangerously close to the throne. Messalina didn't hesitate. She accused Livilla of adultery with the philosopher Seneca the Younger. The charge was almost certainly fabricated, a convenient political weapon. Claudius, easily swayed by his young wife, exiled his own niece to a barren island, and, a year later, had her starved to death. With one move, Messalina had eliminated a rival and sent a brutal message to the court. Her position was absolute. The philosopher Seneca, a man of immense intellect and influence, was also exiled as part of the plot. This was another calculated move. Seneca was a powerful voice, a kingmaker who could rally support for a different faction. By removing him, Messalina was isolating potential threats, clearing the board of her enemy's most powerful pieces. These were not the actions of a girl lost in the excesses of the court. They were the cold, precise strikes of a political animal learning to hunt. She understood that in Rome, power wasn't just held. It was defended, aggressively and without mercy. Every potential rival was a dagger aimed at the heart of her son, Britannicus. Every friendly senator was a potential traitor. She moved to consolidate her circle, elevating allies and destroying enemies with a terrifying efficiency. Men who crossed her found themselves accused of treason. Women who competed for Claudius's attention vanished into exile, or were met with sudden, unexplained deaths. She built a network of informants, spies, and loyalists within the palace, turning the gilded cage into her personal fortress. She convinced Claudius to grant her honors and titles that no empress had held before, inserting herself into the very iconography of imperial power. Her face began to appear on coins in the eastern provinces, a symbol of stability and dynastic continuity. Was this the work of a depraved soul, a teenager drunk on newfound power, lashing out with the viciousness of a spoiled child? This is the story her enemies would later write. It is the story that has echoed through history. But through another lens, a darker, more pragmatic picture emerges. The picture of a young woman who had witnessed firsthand the lethal instability of the Roman court. She had seen what happened to those who were weak, those who were unprepared. She was fighting for her survival and the survival of her children in the only way she knew how. Her ruthlessness was a direct response to the ruthlessness of the world she inhabited. It was a preemptive strike in a war she hadn't started, but was determined not to lose. She had learned the brutal calculus of Roman politics. It is better to be feared than to be a victim. And in her quest to be feared, she began to lay the very foundation for the monstrous reputation that would eventually consume her. She was building her throne on the bones of her enemies, unaware that she was also building her own funeral pyre. To understand the legend of Messalina, the insatiable empress, the predator of the palace, you cannot simply listen to the stories. You must ask a far more important question: who wrote them? History is not a divine transcript of the past. It is a narrative crafted by authors with agendas, allegiances, and, most importantly, masters to please. The story of Messalina was written by the victors, and it was written with the specific purpose of destroying her memory. Our primary sources for her life are three men: Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. They were not court journalists writing in real time. They were historians, working decades, even over a century, after Messalina was dead and buried. Tacitus, the most respected of the three, was writing under the Flavian dynasty, a regime that built its legitimacy on the supposed moral decay of the Julio-Claudians they had replaced. Suetonius was a court official with a love for scandalous gossip and salacious detail. Cassius Dio was a senator writing almost 200 years after the fact. Critically, all of them were writing long after Messalina's ultimate enemy, Agrippina the Younger, had triumphed. Agrippina, the mother of the future Emperor Nero, was the woman who replaced Messalina as Claudius's wife. It was in her direct interest, and the interest of her son's regime, to paint her predecessor not just as a political failure, but as a monster of sexual depravity, a cautionary tale of female power run amok. The stories they tell are not history in its purest form. They are the echoes of a masterful political assassination, a character assassination so complete that it has stained every account of her life since. And the crown jewel of this campaign of character assassination is the story of the brothel. It is the most infamous, the most repeated, the most shocking tale of them all. As the historian Pliny the Elder first recorded, and Juvenal later immortalized in his satires, Messalina was not content with the palace. She was not satisfied with handsome senators or athletic gladiators. She supposedly possessed a lust so vast, so unquenchable, that she had to seek out the ultimate thrill. The story goes that she would wait for her husband, the emperor, to fall asleep. Then, disguised with a blonde wig and a common cloak, the Empress of Rome would slip out of the palace, accompanied by a single maidservant. She would make her way to the Subura, the grimy, bustling, red-light district of the city. There, she would enter a lupanar, a common brothel, and rent out a cheap, filthy cell for the night under the pseudonym Lysiska, a name that translates to wolf girl, a common slang term for a prostitute. The historians describe her actions with a mixture of horrified fascination and moralistic glee. They claim she would stand in the doorway of her cell, her nipples gilded with gold, and solicit customers like any common streetwalker. They wrote that she would service any man who came, from mule drivers to street cleaners, not for power or money, but for the sheer physical thrill of it. The story culminates in a grotesque contest. She supposedly challenged the brothel's most famous and hardworking prostitute, a woman named Scylla, to a marathon of sexual endurance, to see who could take on more men in a single 24-hour period. Messalina, they wrote, won the contest with an astonishing score of 25 partners, only stopping when the brothel keeper forced her to leave in the morning. Yet, even then, she was, as Juvenal wrote, still raging with the fever of her womb. Now, let us step back from the lurid fantasy and apply the cold, hard light of logic. This is the Empress of Rome. Her face was known throughout the city, if not from public appearances, then from the very coins that people used to pay for such services. Is it remotely plausible that she could operate anonymously in a public brothel, surrounded by people who would have recognized her in an instant? The risk of exposure, the sheer logistical absurdity of it, is staggering. Furthermore, the story itself is almost too perfect, too symmetrically depraved. It reads less like a historical account and more like a morality play, a piece of vicious satire designed to hit every single Roman cultural anxiety about female power and unchecked female sexuality. This is the core of the propaganda. In Roman society, a woman's sexual conduct was directly tied to her family's honor and the stability of the state. A chaste woman was a symbol of Roman virtue. An unchaste woman, especially an empress, was a symbol of chaos, corruption, and the breakdown of social order. Accusing a powerful woman of nymphomania was the single most effective way to delegitimize her. It transformed her political ambition into base animal lust. It suggested that she was not a thinking, strategic player, but a slave to her own desires, and therefore unfit to hold any influence over the state. The story of Lysiska wasn't meant to be believed in its literal details. It was meant to create an archetype, the image of a ravenous sexual predator who happened to wear the imperial crown. So, if she wasn't working in a brothel, what was the reality behind the rumors? The truth is likely far more political and far less spectacular. Messalina was known to have a circle of powerful allies, men she elevated to positions of influence. She was also known to host gatherings and maintain relationships that were outside the formal, public view of the court. Could these clandestine political meetings have been deliberately reimagined and sensationalized by her enemies as sexual trysts? A secret political alliance, in the hands of a hostile propagandist, easily becomes a secret love affair. A political gift to secure loyalty becomes a payment for sex. Consider the case of Gaius Appius Junius Silanus. He was a powerful senator whom Messalina convinced Claudius to recall from Spain and betroth to her own mother. He was brought into the very heart of the imperial family. Then, suddenly, Messalina and the powerful freedman Narcissus turned on him. They claimed to Claudius that they had both had identical dreams in which Silanus was assassinating the emperor. On the basis of this supposed dream, Claudius had Silanus executed immediately. The ancient historians frame this as a purely personal drama. They claim Silanus had refused Messalina's sexual advances, and in her wounded pride, she engineered his death. But again, look through the political lens. Silanus was a man with a powerful lineage and military command. Was he recalled to be an ally, but then discovered to be a threat? Did he plot against Claudius, and was the dream simply a theatrical way for Messalina and Narcissus to present their evidence to a superstitious and paranoid emperor? By twisting this political execution into a story of sexual rejection, her enemies achieved two goals. They erased her political acumen, portraying her as a petty, hormonal woman. And they painted her as a sexual predator who would kill any man who dared to refuse her. It was a masterful piece of character assassination, turning a calculated act of state security into a soap opera of lust and revenge. This became the pattern. Every political enemy she eliminated was posthumously recast as a spurned lover. Every ally she promoted was labeled a sexual partner. The propaganda machine was relentless, grinding away at her reputation, burying the savvy political operator under the caricature of a nymphomaniac. And the most terrifying part is that it worked. The caricature has outlived the woman by 2,000 years. For 7 years, Messalina had navigated the treacherous waters of the Roman court with a brutal efficiency. She had played the game of whispers, accusations, and executions, eliminating rivals and consolidating power for herself and her son, Britannicus. She was the most powerful woman in the world, the untouchable empress. And then, in the autumn of 48 AD, she did something so audacious, so utterly insane, that it has baffled historians for 2 millennia. It was an act that seemed to leap beyond the bounds of political calculation and into the realm of pure self-destruction. While her husband, the Emperor Claudius, was away from Rome, visiting the port city of Ostia to oversee the grain supply, Valeria Messalina married another man. This wasn't a secret affair. It wasn't a quiet ceremony hidden in a back room of the palace. It was a public wedding, complete with a signed marriage contract, a dowry, witnesses, and a lavish, drunken celebration. The groom was Gaius Silius, a handsome, charismatic, and ambitious senator who had been widely known as her lover. In the absence of the emperor, the empress held a wedding ceremony in the heart of Rome, an act of open, undeniable bigamy that was, by every Roman law and custom, an act of high treason. How do we explain this? How do we comprehend an act that seems like a political suicide note written in flashing neon letters? For the ancient historians, the propagandists who crafted her monstrous legend, the answer was simple and obvious. It was all about lust. In their telling, Messalina was so hopelessly infatuated with the beautiful Silius, so lost in her own decadent world of sexual obsession, that she had lost all touch with reality. The historian Tacitus paints a picture of a woman driven by a demented passion, a reckless desire that had finally boiled over into madness. He claims she had grown tired of adultery and demanded the name of a wife, craving the legitimacy of a formal union with her lover. In this version of events, the wedding was the ultimate act of a spoiled, entitled nymphomaniac, a woman who believed she was so powerful she could literally have it all, the status of empress and the thrill of a new husband, without consequence. The celebration that followed is described as a bacchanalian orgy, a drunken harvest festival where the new bride and groom cavorted wildly, a final, defiant spectacle of depravity before the inevitable fall. This narrative is compelling. It is dramatic. It is the perfect, explosive climax to the story of the depraved empress. But it is also deeply, fundamentally flawed. It asks us to believe that Messalina, a woman who had spent 7 years masterfully playing the lethal game of Roman politics, a woman who had outmaneuvered and destroyed dozens of powerful enemies, suddenly threw it all away for a romantic whim. It asks us to believe that Gaius Silius, an intelligent and ambitious senator, would risk his life and career in a public act of treason that had zero chance of success. The story simply doesn't hold up under political scrutiny. A secret affair is one thing. A public marriage to the wife of a living emperor is an open declaration of war, and you do not declare war unless you have a plan to win. This is where modern historical analysis offers a second, far more terrifying and logical explanation. The marriage to Gaius Silius was not about sex, it was not about love. It was a political coup, a desperate, high-stakes gamble to seize control of the Roman state. To understand this, we must look at the political climate of 48 AD. Claudius was now in his late 50s. His health was reportedly failing, and his eccentricities were wearing thin on the Senate. More importantly, a powerful new faction was rising within the court, centered around Claudius's niece, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina was just as ruthless and ambitious as Messalina, and she had a son, the future Emperor Nero, whose claim to the throne could one day rival that of Messalina's son, Britannicus. Messalina could feel the political ground shifting beneath her feet. She knew that if Claudius died, her enemies, led by Agrippina, would likely seize power, and both she and her son would be executed. Her survival, and the survival of her lineage, depended on securing the succession for Britannicus while Claudius was still alive. From this perspective, the marriage to Silius transforms from an act of passion into an act of calculated treason. Silius was not just a handsome lover, he was a consul designate, a member of the highest echelon of the Roman aristocracy. He was popular, respected, and childless, meaning he posed no dynastic threat to Britannicus. The plan, as reconstructed by many modern historians, was likely this. Messalina and Silius would formalize their alliance through marriage, creating a powerful new partnership. This public act would serve as a signal, a rallying cry to their supporters in the Senate and the Praetorian Guard. They would force a constitutional crisis, presenting Rome with a choice: the aging, increasingly unpopular Claudius, or a vibrant new power couple, Silius and Messalina, who would act as regents for the young heir, Britannicus. It was a plot to orchestrate a bloodless coup, a transfer of power that would secure her son's future and eliminate the threat of Agrippina for good. But why do it so publicly? Why the flamboyant ceremony? This may have been the most critical and, ultimately, the most fatal part of the plan. A secret plot could be discovered and crushed in the shadows. A public act of defiance, however, forces everyone to choose a side. It was a psychological shock tactic, designed to shatter the inertia of the court and create an undeniable political reality before Claudius even had time to react. They were betting that the Senate, which despised Claudius, would favor a transfer of power to one of their own. They were betting that the Praetorian Guard could be bought or persuaded to support the new regime. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity, a move that staked everything on a single roll of the political dice. They were leveraging Messalina's established power, her influence over key appointments, and Silius's sterling reputation. They were likely spending vast sums of money to buy loyalty. The drunken orgy described by Tacitus might well have been the celebration of a successful conspiracy, a gathering of key plotters to toast their imminent victory. For a few short days, while Claudius was in Ostia, it might have seemed like the gamble was paying off. They had made their move, and the sky hadn't fallen. The city was quiet. They were the new masters of Rome. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They had underestimated the power of the men who truly ran the empire from the shadows, the imperial freedmen, the small cabal of former slaves who served as Claudius's chief advisors. And one of them, a man named Narcissus, was about to bring their entire world crashing down. The coup, for all its public bravado, was a house of cards built on a foundation of rumor and ambition. And the man who would blow it all down was not a senator or a general, but a former slave. His name was Narcissus. As Claudius's chief secretary, he was one of a trio of powerful Greek freedmen, along with Pallas and Callistus, who effectively ran the day-to-day administration of the Roman Empire. They were the true power behind the throne, the gatekeepers to the emperor, and their loyalty was not to Messalina or Silius, but to the system that had given them their immense wealth and influence, the reign of Claudius himself. The marriage of Messalina and Silius was not just an act of treason against the emperor, it was a direct threat to their own survival. A new regime would mean new favorites, and they would be the first to be purged. As news of the wedding in Rome reached the imperial court in Ostia, a tense, paranoid drama began to unfold. According to Tacitus, Claudius's favorite mistresses were the first to alert him, terrified for their own positions. But the emperor was a man defined by indecision and fear. He was paralyzed, unsure of what to believe, terrified of making a move against his powerful wife. It was Narcissus who seized control of the moment. He understood that he had to force the emperor's hand before the conspiracy could solidify its support in the city. In a masterstroke of political theater, he burst into Claudius's chambers and dramatically announced the takeover. He didn't present it as a rumor. He presented it as an accomplished fact. Silius was now the master of Rome, he claimed, and Claudius had lost the empire. The psychological ploy worked. Claudius, terrified and confused, did the only thing he could. He handed over absolute authority to the one man who seemed to have a plan. For one day, Narcissus was effectively the Emperor of Rome. He immediately seized command of the Praetorian Guard and orchestrated a swift, brutal crackdown. The hunt began. Silius was arrested while presiding over a local court, seemingly oblivious to the fact that his coup had already failed. He was dragged before Claudius, and, knowing his fate was sealed, asked only for a quick death. He was executed without delay. The same fate met the other key conspirators. The party was over. The purge had begun. Messalina, meanwhile, had her world collapsing around her. As the news of the counterattack spread, her supporters melted away into the shadows. She was abandoned. Her final hours are a portrait of absolute desperation. She fled to the gardens of Lucullus, a vast and beautiful estate she had coveted and acquired through ruthless means. It was there, in the very symbol of her power and greed, that she would make her last stand. She was accompanied only by her mother, Domitia Lepida, a woman with whom she had reportedly had a strained and difficult relationship. The final moments, as described by Tacitus, are heavy with tragic irony. Her mother, seeing her daughter weeping and composing self-pitying speeches, offered her a cold dose of aristocratic reality. "Your life is over," she said. "All that is left is to make a decent end." She handed Messalina a dagger, urging her to commit suicide, the honorable Roman way out for a disgraced noble. But Messalina, the woman who had ordered the deaths of so many, could not bring herself to do it. Her hands trembled. She hesitated. The killer had lost her nerve. The final decision was made for her. A tribune of the Praetorian Guard, sent by Narcissus, burst into the gardens. He found the former empress on the floor, her mother holding her. Without ceremony, without a final word, he drew his sword and ran her through. She was 28 years old, but death was not the end of her punishment. Claudius, upon hearing of her execution, reportedly showed no emotion. He simply asked for another cup of wine. And in the days that followed, the Senate, eager to prove their loyalty to the restored emperor, decreed the ultimate punishment: damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. It was an official act of historical erasure. Her name was chiseled off public monuments. Statues of her were pulled down and destroyed. Coins bearing her image were recalled and melted. It was an order to the Roman world to forget that Valeria Messalina had ever existed. Yet, here we are, 2,000 years later, still speaking her name. The irony is profound. Her enemies failed to erase her. In fact, their campaign of character assassination, the very stories they crafted to destroy her reputation, are the reason she is immortal. The lurid tales of the brothel, the scandalous affairs, the insatiable lust. This monstrous caricature they created was so compelling, so shocking, that it refused to be forgotten. The real woman, the teenage bride, the ruthless political operator, the desperate mother fighting for her son's future, the failed coup plotter, was buried beneath a legend. But the legend itself survived. The monster they invented became one of the most enduring figures in Roman history. The story of Messalina is more than just a tale of sex and power. It is a chilling reminder that history is not simply what happened, it is what gets written down and who gets to write it. A person's reputation can become a prison, trapping their soul for millennia after their body has turned to dust. She stands as a testament to the brutal power of propaganda, a ghost forged in the crucible of political hatred, forever damned by the stories of the men who defeated her. She wanted to be remembered as the mother of an emperor. Instead, she is remembered as Rome's most depraved empress. And perhaps that is the most horrific fate of all. If you want to continue digging into the buried stories and destroyed reputations of the past, then join us on this journey. Subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments. Which historical figure do you believe has been most unfairly condemned by history?